Today, I'm going to tell you two stories that each of them at first glance will appear to be sort of a run-of-the-mill true crime story. But they are not. I promise you, stick to the end of each of these stories and you'll hear two very unique, very sort of unbelievable plot twists. But before we get into those two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and log on to their computer and email love letters to all of their work contacts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 25th, 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle sat in their police cruiser in the parking lot of a public park in Heilbronn, Germany. They were on their lunch break, and Martin was eating a sandwich and looking out across the park, which was mostly empty because it was a weekday afternoon. So Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and it was generally a pretty safe area. I mean, for the most part, the worst crimes committed here were like break-ins or muggings. So Martin and his partner, they didn't have a whole lot of action happening around them. However, something Martin and Michelle and basically all police officers, for the most part, in Germany were acutely aware of was over the last 14 years, all across Germany, there had been this rash of crimes ranging from, home invasions and robberies to at least 2 murders that had basically all been committed based on DNA evidence by the same person, this singular woman whose nickname was the woman with no face. And she still hadn't been caught yet. And so in essence, all police officers in Germany were sort of like always on the lookout for this woman. She was like the most elusive and sought after criminal in the whole country. But on this particular day, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about how he might get involved in capturing the woman with no face. Instead, he was just worried about his sandwich. And so he went to take another bite of his sandwich when he heard the back doors of his cruiser open up. And he whipped around and he looked, and there were these 2 people who had approached the cruiser, and each of them were carrying a gun. And before Martin or Michelle could do anything, these people raised their weapons and they fired, and everything went black. Within minutes, officers from the Heilbronn Police Department had swarmed the scene. They found Michelle, who was deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. And Martin had also been shot in the head, but he was still alive. He was just unconscious. And so an ambulance rushed him to the hospital while detectives taped off the crime scene and began looking for evidence. Some officers immediately began canvassing the area looking for potential witnesses. But because the park was basically empty all day, there was nobody who had seen the shooting. Other officers looked for footprints in the ground, around the car. They also began looking for fingerprints on the car, bullet casings, hairs, other fibers inside or outside the car. But there was nothing. And so at this point, the investigators are like, okay, all we know is there's been at least one shooter, maybe multiple, because they have not spoken to Martin, who's unconscious. They have no idea what he's seen. So they're seeing that at least one person has managed to come up to a police cruiser, undetected presumably, open up the doors, shoot both officers in the head, and then get away without leaving behind any obvious evidence. It just seemed crazy. Like, have we just missed something? Like, there's got to be something here that sort of points us in the direction of who was responsible. And so in a last-ditch attempt to find something helpful at the crime scene, one officer swabbed the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. They knew that if there was DNA, it could belong to Martin or Michelle or anybody else who might have been inside of this car, and any of those people didn't have to be the shooter or shooters. They could just be people in the car. But it was possible that DNA found inside that car could belong to whoever did this. However, they wouldn't know about this DNA sample until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that could take a really long time. But it was certainly worth it. And so they sent the swabs off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come in, the Heilbronn PD continued trying to find witnesses or any other helpful evidence, anything, but they kept coming up empty. Their only potential witness here was Martin himself, but he was still in a coma at the hospital. It was not until weeks later that finally the police had something to go on, because the DNA results came back. And not only was there DNA found in the car, but what this DNA revealed sent the media into a frenzy and brought this investigation to the national level. At this time, it's mid-2007, and a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Günther Horn was sitting in his office when he got a call from his boss. And his boss told him, the woman without a face has struck again, this time in Heilbronn. Günther's eyes went wide, and he immediately sat up and listened really intently as his boss explained that 2 police officers in Heilbronn had been shot in the head while parked in their cruiser near this park. And the woman with no face, her DNA had been found in the backseat of their car. Now, Günther had always been fascinated by the woman without a face, so he was ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Günther, would lead the investigation into this most recent crime in Heilbronn that was potentially connected to this woman, and to try to finally identify who she was once and for all. Günther immediately said he would do it, and he got to work. Right away, Günther organized a task force to investigate this woman without a face. The task force was based in Heilbronn, but at Günther's command, detectives on the team began reinvestigating all these crimes from all over Germany that this woman was involved in. They searched for patterns, for evidence, or witnesses that maybe had been missed during the original investigation. And through this effort, this team was able to come up with a very rough idea of who this woman was. They knew that she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had a lot of criminal contacts because many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But anytime police had interrogated her co-conspirators, they had refused to say anything about her. It was like they were afraid of her. And there were a couple of other details that struck Günther as being pretty odd. The only evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of these crime scenes was her DNA. And they didn't have a match in the database to pair it with, so they only knew she was a woman, but they didn't know who she was. In 14 years, she'd never left behind a fingerprint, a footprint, a hair, or anything else. So it seemed like, her crimes were extremely deliberate, very clean, very well planned, but also she was clearly leaving behind her DNA at all these crime scenes. It almost seemed like that was her calling card. Also, what Günther and his task force discovered is that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. And this was obviously weird because based on the DNA evidence, they knew unequivocally that their suspect, this woman without a face, was biologically female, not male. And so to Günther, it seemed like, maybe this man that was being seen at these crime scenes was just one of the woman's co-conspirators, or maybe the woman without a face dressed as a man to avoid being caught. But it was impossible to know without a first-hand witness who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Günther really needed. And in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Günther got a call about that exact type of witness that he was looking for. That same day, Günther walked into a hospital in Heilbronn, and he saw Heilbronn police officer Martin Arnold laying in a hospital bed with his eyes open. He'd been in a coma for a month now after being shot, but he had woken up. And he clearly was Günther's best chance of catching the woman without a face because presumably before he was shot, he might have gotten a look at her. So he was that witness who might be able to describe her. And so Günther, he walked over, sat down next to Martin's hospital bed, and he asked him to please tell him everything he remembered about what happened. And Martin, he was very distraught about the whole thing. He's just woken up. He's just learned that his partner has died. And so he's very emotional. But he ultimately tells Günther that, realistically, he can't really remember what happened. He basically turned around. He saw there was, these 2 figures. But after he got shot, it was like he just didn't remember anything. And so realistically, Martin had almost nothing to offer, which meant Günther was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Günther and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros, clocked thousands of hours of overtime, and even offered a reward equivalent to $400,000 for information. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that the whole time this investigation is going on, the woman without a face kept committing crimes. The task force connected her to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And these crimes weren't even just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. So now the entire region was on alert for this woman who seemed like this impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, he couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. According to this officer, the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. They told Gunter that a badly burned body had been found in France, and it was so disfigured that for a while, all police knew was that it was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had come to France had recently been reported missing, and police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork, which included his fingerprints, and they'd been able to lift a DNA profile from those prints. But when they had the DNA analyzed, the results didn't make any sense. And the French police were so baffled by these results that they were now calling Gunter, because they knew if there's someone who needs to know about this, it's Gunter. And so Gunter, after being fully filled in about the baffling results that they had found, he was also at first very confused, but at the same time, he felt this new surge of hope. Because to him, it felt like, as bizarre as this was, maybe this was the break he'd been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the time he was finally going to figure out who this woman really was. So he thanked the French police officer and then brought this new information to his team. And within just a few days, this new information from France did lead Gunter and his team to the woman with no face. It would turn out this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across the entirety of Germany and beyond, appeared to everybody who actually knew her as a totally normal person. Like nobody suspected she was actually responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany, who during the day she appeared to work at a factory, and at night she appeared to just go home. Like she lived a very ordinary life. And so again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that man's fingerprints somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. Primarily because the man was biologically male and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman, that wasn't really possible. And so when the French police saw this, they knew they had to tell Gunter because he was in charge of the woman without a face investigation. And when he and his team looked into this, they figured out something shocking. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, in particular, her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything she did possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line, helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police use in DNA testing. On any given single shift, this woman would touch hundreds or even thousands of these swabs and would accidentally leave her DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer, woman criminal mastermind parading around the whole country. No, there was just a lot of contaminated cotton swabs. And so in essence, police had wasted all this time, nearly 2 decades, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime, chasing a criminal who didn't exist. It was later determined that the police officer Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders previously attributed to the woman without a face are still unsolved, primarily because police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest embarrassments in German police history. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her farmhouse in a small village called Bibongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the whole day working outside on her farm, and now all she wanted to do was grab some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a second. But before she could do any of that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of this knock actually sort of energized her because she was pretty sure that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chung-soo, had finally come home. So Soo-jin and her son ran this farm together, just the two of them. And they really barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town. And he also frequently did odd jobs in the village for extra cash. The problem was, Soo-jin's son would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by to tell his mother where he was going first. And remember, this was 1930 in rural Korea, so it wasn't like he could just call her. And so basically, this mother was left to worry about her son kind of frequently. And over the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin did, because she had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he did go, days at a time in the past, doing these different odd jobs, this stretch was a pretty long time for him to be gone. But she told herself what must have happened is he must have found work with a family who was, having him work and live with them full time. That this was just a great opportunity and he had taken it, and surely he would be home soon. And now it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was home. So Soo-jin, she rushed to the front door, she opened it up, and the smile on her face faded immediately because it was not her son standing at the door. Instead, it was two police officers. And the first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. And Soo-jin told them that, she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality is she didn't know where he was, and he'd been gone for the past week. But don't worry, he wasn't missing. He was very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he'd be home soon. But after she said this, the police looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces and told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief as they told her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy showed he'd been beaten and strangled to death. And for the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people and trying to figure out who this boy was. And based on everything they learned so far, Soo-jin's son was actually the only teenager in the area who wasn't accounted for. But hearing all of this, Soo-jin did not think this could be true. Her son stayed out of trouble and worked really hard. She couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. So she just told the police, this has got to be a mistake. But the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the two police officers. And as they led her through the entrance, down a few hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this really has to be some sort of horrible mistake. It has to be. But the second she actually walked into the morgue and saw the body lying on the table, her eyes welled up with tears because she knew it was her son. And to Soo-jin, this moment felt like leaving real life and entering a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds, and he was very clearly decomposing. It was just awful to see. But as this mother is sort of just staring down at basically a parent's worst nightmare here, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and she told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were actually not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, The clothes thing felt very important. So she started rattling off ideas for, where they could have come from. It was like her brain suddenly became fixated on this one aspect to avoid touching on the trauma of losing her son. She began telling them that, maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them, or maybe he bought them without her knowing, or maybe whoever killed him dressed him up for some reason. But when she said that last part, it was like all at once, the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her. She started shaking, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case, so she'd just been at the farmhouse all alone, trying to make sense of his death. But now, Soo-jin sees these officers, and so she goes right outside and she meets them and she asks them, do you have news for me about what happened to my son? And they tell her that she was likely going to have to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't be worse than finding out your son's been murdered, so she said, okay, let's go inside. And so they went inside the farmhouse, they sat down, and then the police told her that they figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both issued full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chung-soo, had worked with at the inn in town. One of them was a young man and one was a young woman. And apparently, Chung-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was planning to run away with a different man from the village soon. And Chung-soo had told the married man about it. When the woman found out that Chung-soo had done that, she was furious, so furious that she conspired with her coworker, the young man, the other suspect, to lure Chung-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then when they got there, the man and the woman beat up Chung-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the first night that Chung-soo had left the farmhouse. So over that 6-day period, he pretty much went out and immediately was killed. And so over those 6 days, he was never, living with a family and working for them. He was just dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all this, Soo-jin still had one question. What about her son's clothes? Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads, no, and said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin, did feel like the clothes have to mean something, she didn't argue or even, try to come up with other theories about the clothes. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to bury him in the local cemetery. And then after that, she did her best to try to move on, but she never could. And as this nightmare kept happening night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. And so Soo-jin basically stopped sleeping, couldn't really eat, certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She actually began to think she was just gonna wither away and die here unless something changed. I mean, this was horrible. She was overcome with grief and sadness and also just scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then on the night of October 18th, 1931, so about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. When she opened her eyes, she saw this shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, and she immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she actually just began speaking. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Now, Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen here when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have considered, because suddenly the ghost opened their mouth and they spoke. And what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out Chung-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area because he was fearful if he went back home, they would finish the job. They would attack him and kill him. So he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was basically on the run. And so for 6 months, he's living in random towns, doing odd jobs to survive. But eventually, 6 months in, he misses his mom, he misses home, and he goes back and he walks into a room in the middle of the night. He is the ghost. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just says to his mom, "I'm not dead." And he was just being honest. "I'm here, I'm back, I survived." It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who was never identified, by the way, who happened to be in the same area where he had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chung-Soo, they're like, "Shoot, that's him, that was us." And they confessed to killing him because that's what they tried to do. They tried to kill him. They didn't kill him. It was some other body. And then when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and he basically looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. And she fixated on his clothes and she was like, "Something's off." Well, she was right. It wasn't her son. It was someone else's clothes. And so in the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chung-Soo had their murder charges dropped because they didn't commit a murder. And they were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, they were never identified and they were buried in a sort of unmarked grave. And the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we're not able to exhume them because we don't know where their grave is. And so very likely we'll never know who that person was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One night in March of 2016, two friends sat on a couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit close to home, literally, because it was about a missing person who had vanished just miles away from where they lived. And so they're watching this show, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, one of the friends suddenly stood up and began pacing around the room, muttering to themselves. And when the other friend, who was still sitting on the couch watching this, asked them what was wrong, they were not ready for the answer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a really nice, really expensive steak dinner. But make sure you first significantly dull their steak knife. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patrick Iswar hurried out the side door of a hospital in Sète, France, buttoning a fresh-collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto his scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patrick did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrick's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. And one day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrick's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patrick had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey LeVay. But Patrick was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patrick had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past. But she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patrick had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patrick had said, sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrick's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrick would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrick pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrick and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrick's older brother, Mark Iswar, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrick was. Mark frowned because Patrick lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrick hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrick loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it, then he hung up and began calling Patrick's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried, because nobody had heard from Patrick since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start. Patrick's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrick's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrick's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrick. But they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now, Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrick anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrick's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrick's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrick's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrick would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind, all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Ferrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Set. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Verrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Set. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrick Iswar had disappeared. after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrick. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrick just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked, where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrick anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrick had still not turned up. Since then, Patrick's brother, Mark, had been helping the investigation. Verrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrick like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Verrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrick. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Verrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrick was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. Do you want a treat that's both refreshing and indulgent? Well, My Mochi ice cream is creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in sweet, chewy dough that is absolutely satisfying and joyfully chill. My Mochi comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. The strawberry is made with real fruit and tastes like biting into the perfect strawberry at peak summer. It's the perfect balance of chewy and creamy and fruity and cozy. But my favorite flavor is for sure cookies and cream. It's dreamy, creamy, and the cookie bits keep it fun. I take them out of the freezer and I let them soften up just a little bit, and then I can't stop eating them. My Mochi is also gluten-free and only around 70 calories per piece. It comes in a box with 6 individual snacks, which makes it really easy to share. That is, if you want to. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrick's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrick went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrick there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrick had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrick's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrick's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrick into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrick. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrick had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad, but her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features, but she definitely saw her father, Patrick, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be. But Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrick any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Chen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Set police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, he'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrick. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrick's divorce, Patrick had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Shen's wife, a woman named Nadege Shen, who had worked with Patrick at the hospital. Apparently, Nadege had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrick. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadege ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. And then the next day, Remy found Nadege in their garage, hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Shen into an interrogation room at the Sète police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So, right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrick Isouard. Now, this was a total bluff because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrick had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrick went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. 2 weeks had already passed since Patrick's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. Being the last person to see Patrick before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest, but Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot, so he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrick's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act, and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears and she was repeating over and over that Patrick had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here, since they had no body. I mean, who knows what really happened to Patrick at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns. And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patrick, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patrick Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrick's scooter had been abandoned. And so now, Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together, they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere, so it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels, and just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrick's older brother, Marc, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case, again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patrick, and so Verrier had hoped that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patrick had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patrick having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrick's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck, and Verrier understood that Patrick's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Marc snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Marc had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety. because Mark knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public, and if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out, and part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Mark wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patrick. Mark described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Sète. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Mark's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spill out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Isouard on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Sète, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. And they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened to her. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do: go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Chen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off. It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife. And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept his secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Hey guys, I'm back by the fire, and I have another awesome story to share with you. Today's story is this epic survival story, and I mean, the story itself is truly unbelievable, but I'm telling you, the twist at the end, basically how this person was able to survive, you will not see coming. Great plot twist, great story, I know you're gonna like it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come join you at your campfire, but when they show up, just immediately push them into the flames and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 10 a.m. on March 18, 1944, a 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Aimo Koivunen sat around a campfire with a group of other soldiers inside of the Arctic Circle in Northern Europe. They were very deep into the wilderness in this forest that was covered in several feet of snow, and Aimo was melting a pot of that snow over the fire so the group could drink some tea. And at the same time that Aimo was doing this, even though it was kind of relaxing to be sitting here, Aimo, his whole body was basically aching. Number one, it was 5 degrees outside, and this was also the first time that he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in about 2 days. They had been on the move the whole time. So Aimo and his squadron were all members of the Finnish military. And at this point, during World War II, they were actually allied with Nazi Germany. Not because, they were Nazis, they were not, but because Finland and Germany shared a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Aimo and his squadron were in an area called Lapland, which used to belong to Finland. But 4 years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Finland and ultimately forced Finland to cede this land to the Soviets. But now, during World War II, Finland wanted to get their land back, and Germany was helping them do that. And so Aimo and his squadron were in Lapland on essentially a reconnaissance mission. They were there to try to figure out sort of what the Soviets were doing in this part of Lapland and how many Soviets were out there, again, in this particular part of Lapland. However, Aimo and the others had spent the past 2 days skiing all over the place in their area of operations, but so far, they hadn't seen any Soviet soldiers or any Soviet bases.
But, for Aimo and probably for the other soldiers that he was with, this was ultimately a good thing. They were trained for combat, but they didn't necessarily want to come across Soviets and have like a full-blown shootout, in part because the Soviets were just a bigger, more well-equipped military. And, they were also more advanced. And so if they got into a gunfight with them, who knows what would have happened. And so even though Aimo is like sitting here feeling very sore and very tired as he melts his snow, he was ultimately feeling kind of grateful that this reconnaissance mission had proven to be pretty low-key. However, just as the water began to boil, Aimo and the other soldiers heard the unmistakable sound of machine gun fire coming from somewhere that had to be nearby. And so immediately Aimo and the others, they jump up, forget what they're doing, and they're looking to see where this gunfire is coming from. But then before they could even make sense of the situation, Aimo's lieutenant yelled like, "Hey, get ready, get your guns." And so they all scooped up their weapons. Aimo, he's picking his weapon up, and as he looks up, he looked off in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, and he was shocked to see an entire pack of Soviet soldiers bearing down on them. They were literally skiing down this mountainside right nearby, and they were obviously shooting their machine guns, not in random directions, but right at Aimo and the other men. They were clearly being attacked by these Soviets. Now, Aimo and the other men have clearly been trained for this. This is literally why they're out here. They are soldiers. They're ready for this type of encounter. But for a moment, when Aimo sees this overwhelming force that's descending on them, they're clearly outnumbered, like this is going to end badly. All Aimo had in his head was just this overwhelming feeling of just terror. He was the oldest of 6 children, and when he first enlisted in the military, he had promised all of his little siblings that he wouldn't get hurt, he would come home, he would be okay. And now he knew that wasn't going to happen, like he was going to get killed, he just knew it. But Aimo, after sort of breaking out of this initial thought, he looked over at his lieutenant, and his lieutenant looked terrified too, but he quickly composed himself and yelled for Aimo and everybody else to flee. Just moments later, Aimo and the other Finnish soldiers were on their skis, skiing as fast as they could away from the Soviets down the backside of this mountain, just doing anything they could to survive. And as Aimo is skiing away, he can hear the sound of gunfire ricocheting off trees, zipping by his head, like he's thinking at any point, I'm going to get hit, or one of my teammates are going to get hit. There's nothing we can do. We just got to go as fast and as far as we can. And so he's skiing, and actually Aimo was at the front of their formation, so he's actually leading the pack. And so really it was his job to kind of create tracks in the snow that the others could follow in behind. It was easier for them. But it meant he was expending a lot of energy, basically pushing all the snow down as he was making his escape. And as much as he wanted to maintain that position and do this for his teammates, to continue to make tracks here, it was so exhausting. And also, like when you're in combat, you have this unbelievable adrenaline rush that sometimes can lead to like a massive crash of energy. And it was like he had this huge rush of energy, and now it's like he's collapsing despite the need to escape here. It's like his body just cannot go any faster than he's going. And so before long, it's like he found himself slowing down, and his teammates are zipping by him because they can't stop. The bullets are flying fast, like their only hope of survival is just to keep on going. And so Aimo knows that, like, basically, if he can't keep up, he's dead. But his body, it was just he couldn't go any faster. He was slowing down. He was going slower and slower. He can hear the sound of the gunfire getting closer and closer, and he's thinking about his siblings and how devastated they're going to be to find out that he was killed in this war. And so slower and slower he's going. The sounds are getting louder and louder behind him, and he sees the last of his teammates pass him, and he sees them just kind of drift off down the mountain into the white abyss beyond, and they're gone. He's alone, and he just can't keep up. And then finally he just loses control of his skis. He veers off to the side. He starts tumbling down the mountain, smashes into a tree, and he passes out. When Aimo woke up, it was light outside, but he had no idea how much time had passed. He also really had no idea how he was even still alive. Like, what, did the Soviets just decide not to kill me? Or did they not see me? Like, what happened to my teammates? Like, what's going on? He had a lot of questions. But in addition to feeling confused about the whole situation, he also had this really distinct other feeling. He had this immense sense of being alert, like hyper alert, more than really he had ever been in his whole life. It's like he could hear and see everything at like a 10 times level. It's like, oh my God, I know everything going on around me. I'm totally aware. So with his like hyper vigilance that he suddenly was having sort of out of nowhere, he began to, take stock of his situation. Right away, he, was able to see that he's alone. Like the Soviets are not nearby. He's not like being held captive. And again, his comrades are nowhere to be seen. So he's alone in the middle of the wilderness in the Arctic Circle. But he also could see that, okay, well, I still have my skis, so I can still get around. He still had his boots on. He still had his equipment on. Like he had the things he needed to survive. He even had his compass still, which had been in his hand, but he hadn't lost it. And so he had a way to navigate, and he had his weapon still. And so he's thinking, okay, like the situation's bad, but I have what I need to survive for some time. And he also realized that sort of amazingly, despite clearly crashing as a minimum and smashing into this tree that he was laying near, despite that, he didn't feel any pain in his body. And he didn't appear to have any injuries. So he's thinking, what a miracle here, that the worst thing that's happened here is I've basically been abandoned and I'm effectively lost, but it could be worse. And so Imo, after, taking stock of his situation, he eventually stood up and he looked off into the distance and he saw maybe 6 or 7 miles away, there was smoke up on this mountain off in the distance. And he immediately recognized that mountain was actually what appeared to be the rendezvous point for he and his squadron if they ever got separated. And so he's looking out at this mountain and seeing, the signs of potential life over there. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, those are my teammates. That's where they've gone. They've gone to the rendezvous point. All I need to do is go to that mountain. So Imo scooped up his backpack and picked up his gun and whatever other equipment he had on the ground. And then he started skiing towards this mountain. And for a while, he just kept on staring up at the smoke coming off the mountain, making sure he was going in the right direction. And as he got closer, he was nearly positive he could see that in addition to the smoke, he could see what appeared to be little lean-to tents on the mountainside, which were telltale signs that those were Finnish soldiers. That's how they set up their tents. So he's thinking, this is it. Like, I'm going to be saved. I just got to get there. And he had so much energy, maybe because he was so close to being rescued or something. But he felt like this huge surge of energy. It was like nothing could make him tired. And then finally, Imo got close enough to this campsite on the side of this mountain that he actually could see faces. He could see the other soldiers, and they were his, Finnish comrades. They had clearly gone to the rendezvous point, and they hadn't seen him yet. And so here he is, feeling like full of energy. He's barreling towards them, and he starts calling out to them. He's thinking they're going to be like totally shocked that, anybody would just come out of the wilderness towards their campsite, let alone Imo, who they must have assumed by this point was dead. Also, he's thinking, I don't want them to shoot at me, thinking I'm a Soviet soldier, so I better get their attention. And so he's yelling out for his comrades. And at some point, one of the men, they turn and they see Imo, and their reaction is not what Imo wanted. Their reaction was being really shocked, grabbing their weapon and shooting at him. And before long, all these soldiers, all of his comrades, are opening fire on Imo. And Imo's like, come on, like, I'm one of you, what are you doing? But he's already going so fast, skiing so fast, that his only move was to basically ski right down the middle of their camp and just go to the other side of the mountain. And so he literally skied through this campsite with all of his comrades shooting at him, who miraculously missed him, so he doesn't get shot somehow. The bullets are whizzing past his head, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, they think I'm a Soviet. Come on, I'm calling out to you guys. I'm not a Soviet. But he barrels past them, and then after he's pretty far away from this campsite, he's yelling back to them like, guys, it's me, it's Imo, what are you doing? But they're yelling and they're shooting in his direction. And so he had no choice but to just keep on skiing away from them, away from safety, or what he believed was going to be safety. And so on he went for hours and hours, just skiing and skiing away from this ambush, if you will. And the whole time he's thinking, like, what happened? Even if they shot at me at first, couldn't they have figured it out that, like, I'm one of you? Like, wouldn't you have realized that eventually as I skied right through your campsite? I have the same uniform as you. I have the same weapon as you. You recognize me? Like, what was that? And so he has no idea what happened, but he's like how do I have so much energy? Like, how am I able to do this? I've been skiing for hours and hours and hours. I've been shot at so many times. Like, this is surreal. What's happening? Like, what is going on here? And so Aimo just continued skiing for hours and hours until it was abundantly clear he was not in shooting range. He didn't hear the sound of any gunfire. Like, he's safe again. Still very confused why this was even happening, but he's safe. The sun's gone down, and so he thinks, like, okay, I need to stop. I need to make camp. I need to regroup. But it was at this point that he's thinking to himself, like, I haven't eaten anything. I haven't had any water. I've basically been at a full sprint, like skiing at a full sprint here for practically the whole day. I've had multiple near-death experiences. I smashed into a tree during that initial, skirmish, but I feel great. I feel like I have more energy than I've ever had in my whole life. And so he's just caught by, like, how am I able to do this? Is this what it's like when you're in a true survival situation? Like your body just goes into like overdrive or something? Like he couldn't understand it. And so he's standing there, like, basically telling himself, you really need to stop. Even though you have the energy to go pretty much indefinitely, you need to stop, you need to make a fire, you need to have food, you need to have water, you need to rest. But it was like he was forcing himself to do these things. He didn't feel compelled to do them. It was like, oh, that's right, I need to, like, do human stuff. And so that's what he did. He stopped, he built a fire, he made some food, and he's, like, not hungry at all, but he's eating the food, forcing himself to. He's having some water. And then he said, okay, I'll rest, and then in the morning I'll figure out what to do next. But he lays down to go to sleep, and he should have been completely exhausted, but he wasn't. He couldn't even sleep, like, not at all. He just laid there completely wide awake as the wind and sleet and snow whipped all around him, and he just laid there, again, feeling great, but just not tired at all. The next morning, when the sun came up, Aimo had not slept at all, but still he was able to get up, put his skis on, and get his stuff and continue skiing, basically in the direction that he believed would bring him back to Finland. And as he was skiing, he's thinking to himself, it's kind of interesting because when he first got attacked by the Soviets, it was like his mind was clear, but his body failed him. Like, his legs got so tired from trying to cut those tracks in the snow that he fell off and crashed. And that sort of led him to this position. But now, for whatever reason, it was like his mind was delirious. Like, he couldn't keep his thoughts straight, but his body was like a Terminator. Like, he just kept on going no matter what. And so he just kept on skiing, almost like without even thinking. His body was like on autopilot. And so he skied for hours and hours and hours just in this one direction that he sort of loosely believed would bring him back to Finland. And the whole time he's skiing, he didn't see another soul. He is out in the middle of, the Arctic Circle. There's no more Soviets. There's no more teammates, nothing. He's just out in the middle of the wilderness. And realistically, he didn't know if he was even remotely going in the right direction, but he was just going to go. But that night, as he's still just skiing in a straight line, not stopping, sort of unbelievably, he looked up ahead and he saw somebody, the first person he had seen since, the ambush at the campsite. And even more unbelievable is the person he saw was one of his teammates. It was this guy named Matty. He was a comrade of his. They had been together when the Soviets had first attacked. And so immediately Aimo's thinking, like, clearly Matty got separated as well, and it's just serendipity that we have wound up at the same place. And so Aimo, he skis right up to Matty, and he's waving him down. He's so relieved to see him. And Matty, when he looks over at Aimo, he doesn't shoot at him, but he sort of tells him to, like, be quiet, like, calm down. And he kind of beckons him over. And when Aimo comes up next to Matty, he has all these questions, like, what do we do? Where are we going? But Matty just tells him, like, just to be quiet, and then gestures to lay down on the ground. And so Aimo doesn't really know what's going on here, but he trusts Matty. Matty is not shooting at him. That was a good sign. And so the two of them just laid in the snow. They laid down right there. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Aimo was able to feel tired enough that when he closed his eyes, he did drift off to sleep almost right away. When Aimo woke back up again, he was not lying down in the snow with Matty. He was instead standing up on his skis, skiing down a mountain, like on a mission. Matty's nowhere to be found. And on top of that, he didn't have his backpack and he didn't have his gun. had no idea how long he'd been skiing for. He didn't know like where he was going. It was like he went from passed out to skiing, just magically skiing. Now, realistically, at this point, IMO is thinking to himself, clearly what's happening here is I'm like hallucinating or something. Because how is it possible that I was just with Maddie laying on the ground sleeping and now I'm here? Like, it didn't add up. And so as he's just sort of mindlessly skiing along, he's like telling himself like, this is you dying. Like, this is you losing your mind before you die. Like your mind is all over the place. Your body's still going for reasons he didn't really understand. Still at, full tilt, full energy, didn't know why. But at some point that's going to give out and you're just going to die. Like, that's what's going to happen here. And so Aimo's only hope was that between now and when he died, that hopefully somebody would see him and save him. He knew it was an outside chance, but at this point, that's all he had. And so on he skied. No weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He's basically operating on no sleep, and he's just skiing. And for days and days, he doesn't stop. He can't believe his body is keeping up as well as it is. His mind is like totally gone, but he is just going for days and days and days. Doesn't run into anyone. But then one day, again, days later, he's skiing along and magically almost in front of him appears this building. He can't tell if it's necessarily a military outpost or civilian. He doesn't know if it's Finnish or German or Soviet. But he knows, even in his totally fractured mental state, that attempting to go in that building and hoping there are people in there that will save him, even if they won't, even if they kill him maybe, that is a better outcome, a better choice than doing what he's doing right now, which is the sort of endless ski to his death. And so Aimo starts skiing faster and faster towards this building, just like full reckless abandon, fully committed to this is my rescue or this is my death. And as he gets closer, he sees, sort of unbelievably, that this is a military installation, and it is a German military installation. And remember, the Finnish are allied with the Germans at this point, and so this is a safe place for him. And so he's so relieved, he can't believe he's going to potentially survive this thing. He takes off his skis, and he starts running towards the front door of this building. But before he gets to the front door, he steps on something, and then there is a loud bang, and he's thrown into the air and comes crashing down. And when Aimo opened his eyes and sort of took stock of what had happened, he didn't feel any pain, but he looked down and he saw his foot was just a bloody mess. There was literally bones poking out of his ankle. Like he could see, clearly he sustained a horrible injury, and he must have just stepped on a landmine. But Aimo, determined to get into that building, he pulled himself up, again, sort of channeling this unbelievable just endurance he had been feeling the past several days that he'd been out here. He stood up and on one foot began hobbling his way towards this installation. And he finally gets to the front door of this German military base. And he grabs the doorknob and he's about to open it when there's another banging sound and he's thrown again into the air. He had stepped on another landmine. And he comes smashing down, and he doesn't die, he doesn't feel any pain, but he looks down at his legs, and he sees his other leg that was not injured a minute ago is now also mangled. So now he can't even stand. He's incapacitated. And on top of that, even though he's near this military outpost, he turns and looks at it, and now that he's a little bit closer and he's sort of looking more, intentionally at this building, he realizes it's abandoned. Like, this isn't going to save him. He's trapped. He's in the middle of nowhere, and there's no one here. And so at this point, Aimo just said, you know what? It's over. Like, I'm going to die. And so he literally just crawled his way over to this nearby ditch, let himself roll into it, and he just waited to die. He just knew it was over. But he didn't die. For days, he just laid in this ditch, like, unable to die. He wanted to die. He wanted this to be over. Like, what else is he going to do? Who's going to save him? But he just watched the sun come up and set, go up, set, over and over and over. He lost track of how many days he was just laying there, again, bleeding profusely, like grievously injured. He hasn't eaten anything. He hasn't had any water. Like, he can't believe he's still alive. He really can't believe it. And then as he's laying there, one of these days, he's just in this ditch. He looks up during the daytime, and he sees what looks like a plane flying overhead. Now, at this point, Imo is in very bad shape. I mean, he's alive, but it's not going well. And he knows that, so he doesn't know if he's hallucinating this or what, but he felt like it was real. But after watching this plane circle overhead for a minute, Imo was almost certain he heard the sound of this plane landing nearby. And then a couple of minutes later, he could have sworn from the ditch, he can't really see anything, he could hear the sound of people speaking in Finnish, his native language. Again, he didn't know if he was hallucinating or not, but he sees this head poke over the top of the ditch. And it was this young man, this young Finnish guy, and he's looking down at Imo, and Imo's looking back up at him. And then a second later, Imo was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, Imo found himself laying in a hospital bed inside of a hospital in Finland. Like the man in the plane, all that, not a hallucination. He really had been rescued. And once he was at the hospital, it turned out he weighed just 94 pounds. He was also badly burned and frostbitten, and both of his legs were very badly mutilated and mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, despite the fact he's just laying in bed, not doing anything. And even more crazy was they couldn't actually get his heart to slow down. It just kept beating at this crazy high level. Now, at first, doctors and nurses and all the staff were really shocked by Imo's condition. Not really just that he had survived, but again, his heart rate. It just seemed like, dude, how are you alive right now? Your heart can't beat at this level for this long without eventually killing you. But after they spoke to Imo and had him recount the whole ordeal of him being out, getting shot at and lost and the whole thing, they learned one really specific thing that explained the whole thing. When Imo and his, Finnish comrades were initially ambushed by the Soviet soldiers, they decided to flee. But Imo, he was having such a hard time physically keeping up with the other soldiers. He was just getting so tired from trying to break the tracks, and then he fell off, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't find a way to keep up, I'm gonna get captured or get killed by the Soviets. And so he's desperate. And so before he ultimately crashed down the side of the mountain from exhaustion, he tried something to try to give himself some energy, to try to make this escape. He pulled out these special military rations that he had been issued, along with everybody else in his squadron. They were all given these rations. And the reason you take these rations is to give yourself some energy. And so he takes these rations, and he's thinking, this is going to do it. This is going to give me the boost I need to get out of here and make the escape with my teammates. But the rations didn't work. And so he did sort of completely fall off. He was so tired to the point where he literally tumbled down the side of the mountain. His teammates, they skied off, and he smashes into a tree and he passes out. However, when Imo woke up, one, he was amazed he had not been captured or killed by the Soviets, but he's realizing he's all alone and what's going to happen to me? And then he starts to feel man, I just have a lot of energy. I can see and perceive things on a level that I couldn't before. Well, that's because the military rations had kicked in. And now he had this abundance of energy. And it allowed him to basically ski indefinitely without sleeping, without having water, without food. He gets blown up twice. His feet have been blown off, basically. He's laying in a ditch dying, but he just can't seem to die. The guy should have died several times, but these rations did their job. They gave him all the energy he needed to survive this crazy, crazy 2 weeks in the wild. Well, the military rations, they're called Pervitin. And this drug, I don't know if it's still given to soldiers now, but probably not, because effectively what Pervitin is just pure crystal meth. And so in essence, Imo survived in the wild for all this time because he was on just a pure meth-fueled rage. He was just completely high for 2 weeks, and it saved his life. One thing to note about Pervitin is it does have two distinct downsides. One, it is incredibly addictive, and two, it creates really, really intense hallucinations. And so very likely, he did not come across his own battalion who then opened fire on him. He did not come across Maddie, his teammate out in the wild who told him to lay down. And who knows, we're not even sure if the military installation he saw was real. Very likely all of that was just in his mind. However, the landmines, those were real. Somewhat unbelievably, IMO would make a full recovery, and he would go on to get married, he would have 9 children, and he would live to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that did save his life, he never took Pervitin again.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.